Welcome back to another live stream with Professor Steve Keen. And hey, Ty Keens, I'm here too. You put your questions in the chat. We're going to try to get to as many as them or of them as we can. We still don't have a title for the show, so if you want to come up with something, I think I've got Ask a Real Economist a question. If there's a real economist out there, point them out. So get your questions in the chat. I'm going to bring on the man himself. Here he is, Professor Steve Keen. Steve.
Hi, I just it's Saturday. It must be Steve Keen live. That's the current state of things. I don't travel around the world anymore. I travel across the internet. So, but yeah, lots of activities. Too damn busy for my own life. But here we are yet again.
Tell me more about the activities this week.
Well, I went down to Bordeaux because one of my members of the school, the online class that I teach, he's doing his PhD with Danny Lang, who's a good friend of mine who is a French economist. He established the Society of Appalled Economists at the time of the global financial crisis to argue for change in economics. So he was giving a paper down there based on my energy work. So it was the stuff I've done recently to show that the Cobb-Douglas production function, which all neoclassicals use for, well, not all, but anybody doing dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models uses the Cobb-Douglas production function. And I showed that it's a farce because there's all sorts of statistical errors with it, but also that what they call the role of technology is actually the role of energy in production. So I went down for him to give that talk. It was in Bordeaux, so I got a 8-hour train ride from Amsterdam to Bordeaux for that. That was was it Wednesday? I think that was Thursday, I think. So that was no chance to give my usual lecture on Thursday. His presentation on hang on. I went down for that Tuesday. It was on Wednesday. Came back Thursday. And now we've spent time working with another energy expert, which is a guy called Kerry King, who's based at the University of Texas. He came back for a few days on that. And then I had an interesting meeting, which I won't talk about here, but I will talk about at the online class on Wednesday with a member of a consulting firm and the potential use of my software. We'll have to wait and see, and me, for that matter. And then back with you. Then tomorrow I'm off to London, again by train, to talk at London Climate Week the title of my paper is The Appallingly Bad Neoclassical Economics of Climate Change. And I'm giving that presentation in a session with MIR, which stands for Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing. I'm doing that on Monday, and then on Tuesday I come back over here again, back to Amsterdam.
Wow. You're sure a cultured and well-traveled individual, Steve.
Some people might dispute the first word, but nonetheless, definitely I'm well-traveled.
Marie and I are going to the Calgary Stampede in a couple of weeks, which is, a world-renowned rodeo, I guess. I'm not much of a cowboy, but that should be interesting. So that's across from where I am in Vancouver. It's across the Rocky Mountains. So we'll drive through because just the drive in itself is a vacation. We'll hit Edmonton and then we'll go down to Calgary. We'll look at some dinosaur bones. They have the Badlands there, right? Where there's a lot of fossils and stuff to look at. And then we'll come back through Banff. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Banff, Canada. It's pretty world-renowned place. But anyways, First question of the day we've got from Deplorable. Professor, I was wondering, why didn't we get massive inflation during the quantitative easing in 2008, Steve?
Well, that's with a question like that, you have instantly qualified to become a board member of the Federal Reserve, because they're asking themselves the same question. They actually expected a pulse to inflation because of quantitative easing. And if you read the minutes, which I have, of the Federal Open Monetary Committee, which is the committee of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve that sets interest rates, that was their worry all the way through, because here's this QE, they're injecting so much in the way of additional reserves, into the economy, and that means that there's so much lending potential that the banks have, and they might not lend out during the crisis itself because they have, there's the money multiplier might break down because all the banks lost money during 2007 when the financial crisis came. So they might be a bit conservative, but once the economy recovers a bit, all those reserves will be injected into the economy and cause a huge pulse of inflation, which didn't happen. And the reason that they got it wrong is there is no such thing as the money multiplier. This is something which non-orthodox economists from the days of Basil Moore on have been, and that's back in the 1970s, have been arguing either it doesn't exist or it works in reverse. So if you look at how the money multiplier is notionally derived by economists, it comes out of their theory as to how banks create money, but it also comes out of Milton Friedman's what do you call it? These velocity of money equations. So you have the level of money times the velocity of circulation equals the price level times the level of transactions. That's Milton Friedman's monetarist equation. And what he argued, again, you've got to read Milton Friedman until your eyes pop out, which I have done. Fortunately, I managed to put them back in again. I didn't attach them to my arse, which is a bit obvious to different to most neoclassical economists. That's where I think their eyeballs actually are. But the argument he made was that, first of all, velocity is constant. A huge part of Milton Friedman's academic career was trying to prove that velocity is effectively a constant. Varies a bit, but varies so little you can treat it as a constant. So you got V is a constant. Then he argued transactions are set by economic activity, supply and demand. So that's independent of the monetary system. So in the standard neoclassical explanation of what they think is the real world, transactions are determined by the real decisions of consumers and producers, independent of the monetary system. Money is just a veil over barter. So if you have T being set by supply and demand, V being constant, then you've left with M and P. And if you therefore have a change in M, you're going to get a change in P. So if you increase the amount of money in existence, that's going to cause inflation. So that's the mindset that people have coming from a neoclassical background. Then where does the M come from? That's where the money multiplier turns up. So in the neoclassical theory, the amount of money in existence is the amount of, getting a bit caught up in all the terms in my head here. The amount of money is a function of the reserves that banks are required to hold. So there's required reserve ratio, triple R, and the rate at which, it's the amount of reserves are controlled by the Federal Reserve. The required reserve ratio is also set by the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve sets a required reserve ratio of 10%, for example. Then the money creation mechanism in the money multiplier model is that the government runs a deficit. Okay. The deficit creates a certain amount of money in people's bank accounts. The government creates money in the form of cash. This gets to be very important. So people receive the government welfare payments in cash. They go off to the bank and deposit that cash on the counter with a teller. The teller, let's say it's $100. The teller takes $100 off the depositor and gives them a receipt, which is showing that they've got a bank balance now of $100. The bank owes them $100 as a liability. That's their deposit asset. And then the bank hangs on to $10 of that 100 and lends out 90. And then the people who receive that loan of 90, they then go and deposit that at other banks, and the other banks do the same thing. In this case, with $90, they now hang on to $9 and lend out 81, and then the 81 gets deposited, and so on. You go through a chain reaction, and the ultimate effect is that $100 of new cash created by the government generates through a long-winded process of depositing and relending it by new banks, leads to the creation of $1,000. So when they ran QE, and that's, roughly speaking, QE is roughly $1 trillion. The money multiplier at the time they did this was 10%, with a caveat, which will try and remind me to come back to the caveat. So with $1 trillion into the economy of cash, there's now going to be created by QE. there's now going to be that $1 billion, sorry, 1,000 billion, so $1 trillion of new reserves exist. The banks will, when they get away from their panic because of the crisis, the exogenous shock of the financial crisis, they will then start lending that out, and that 1 trillion of new money will become 10 trillion of money, and the spending of that will cause inflation through the MV equals P times T mechanism. None of that happened. Okay, you first of all read their decision to go with their QE in the minutes. Then you read the fears they had about this huge inflationary surge this would occur. So throughout the whole thing, they were worried about having to put rates up again to control the rate of inflation. Never happened. Okay? Now, they haven't really gone back and examined why, but there's a simple reason. The only way the money multiplier works, and you can work this out when you model it in Ravel, the only way it works is if all loans are in cash. Okay, because again, this is the type of attention to detail that Ravel lets you do, which mainstream economics doesn't have any comparable software for, because they don't think money really matters. All their models about money are to justify why they don't have money or banks or debt in the macroeconomic models. But if you do it in double entry bookkeeping, if somebody deposits $100 in the bank account, that means the deposit account goes up by 100. And then on the other side, the balancing item is a $100 increase in the reserves. But the deposit took the form of cash. Okay, so what goes up in the banks initially is $100 in cash in a vault. Now, if you then try to show the bank lending from those reserves, the standard accounting way of showing lending, the double entry bookkeeping way, if you try to show lending from reserves, then you're going to show a minus. The loan will reduce the amount of reserves in existence. If you want to then show that as increasing the deposits, you get in Ravel's terms, it's a minus on the reserves and a plus on the deposits, which is the mathematical error, because it sums to not to 0, which is what required for each line, but it sums to minus 2 times the $100. In accounting terms, you get either a debit. I think you get a debit and a debit on both sides. Okay, which is it was an accounting error, so it can't be done that way. Second possibility, what about, and if remember, one of the beauties of double entry bookkeeping is you can only have 2 entries per line, and that controls what you can actually show. So if you have a minus on reserves and a plus on deposits, you violate the rules of accounting. That's not how banks can lend out. What you then have to have is a minus on reserves and a plus on loans. Now that meets the equation. Reserves go down, loans go up, the sum is 0. Only problem is there's no way that you don't show in that sense, how does the borrower get the money? So the only way to show that happening is that the borrower's now got an extra liability of debt. Okay, they've got let's say they're lending out the 90, 100 deposited, 90 being lent out. Reserves go down by 90, loans go up by 90. The loans are a asset of the bank, but a liability of the borrower. So the borrower's currently got a liability of additional $90 liability. Why did they agree to it? The only possibility is the loan took the form of cash. So on the borrower's account, what you show is the liabilities go up by 90, but their assets go up by 90 as well. That asset reflecting an increase in the level of cash. And then on it goes. So the only way the money multiplier can work is if all loans are in cash. And then over time, the depositor clunks $100 down on the teller's table. The teller then lends out 90 to the next person who comes in. The next person takes that cash to another bank, puts the 90 on. The teller there hangs on to 9, lends that 81 to the next person. So if all loans are in cash, it works. Well, that means it doesn't work. It's not real. It's not the real world. Maybe 200 years ago, during the 1900s, particularly in America, maybe banks made loans and you walked out of the bank with a suitcase of cash or a wheelbarrow of cash, but that's just not the real world. So the model they have does not work in the real world, and that's why reserves rose and nothing happened to the level of economic activity, apart from the one thing that they got right, and that is when they bought those bonds off, to do QE, what what the Reserve did was buy bonds, existing Treasury bonds back off both banks and non-banks. Now, when you buy them off banks, what happens there is that the value of bonds that the banks have goes down by $1 trillion, and the value of reserves the banks have go up by $1 trillion, and that's it. There's nothing else the banks can do, because banks are only allowed to have basically three classes of assets. They can have reserves, which are assets that reflect the since we're talking the real world now, we're talking electronic accounts, that reflects the value of the liabilities that the central bank has to the private banks through their settlement accounts at the central bank. They can have those. They can buy government bonds. Okay, but the central bank, in this particular case, rather than being able to buy bonds off the central bank, here's the central bank buying bonds off them. So that's not an avenue. So the remaining thing is they can make more loans, but the loans have no relationship there. So it doesn't really change what the private banks could. It just lumps them with a whole lot of reserves, which don't earn any interest. So that was a problem for the banks. It wasn't a solution; it was a problem. But what it did do when the Federal Reserve bought bonds off either the non-bank public or particularly non-bank financial institutions, the vampire squids of the world, that meant that those institutions had their bonds fall by, say, $1 trillion. Their reserves rose by $1 trillion. Now, merchant banks exist to evade the Glass-Steagall Act, because they are allowed to buy shares, and they can also buy property. So when you cut the amount of money that was in the amount of bonds that were owned by the non-bank financial institutions, that meant they ended up with, they went having bonds which earn interest for them and they can trade, to having basically deposit accounts at private banks. And with those deposit accounts at private banks, they bought shares and they bought property. So QE caused a pulse in asset prices, because the shadow banks could use that cash to buy non-financial assets. So shares and property are non-financial assets. They're things which are assets to the people who own them and liabilities to no one. So that's where the valuation of shares comes from, the buying of non-financial assets using financial assets. And that just took off. So that's a reason why we had an asset bubble. That's what they thought they'd do, and they thought that wealth effect would cause more consumption. Well, that's another rabbit hole that doesn't exist. But that's why there was the only inflation we got out of QE was inflation of asset prices, not inflation of nominal of consumer good prices.
I think you hit the caveats there. I remember you asked me, remind me to hit the caveat. I think you hit it. I will say it is possible to have more than two entries on one line for a double
if
entry.
you simply split several, the sum has to be zero, though.
Yeah. So as long as there's 4, 6, you can do more. But other than that, well, that was a very detailed answer on QE. Next question here. What have I? Okay, easy one. We talk about it all the time. So I'll put it up. I'll give my answer. Is the study of economics relevant in today's world? Now, if you're talking about academic economics, I am a living example that it is not necessary, and you can become quite successful in the field when you apply it in the real world. However, I imagine your question is a little more detailed, so I'm going to get you, Steve, to kind of answer this in a way. What's wrong with the current state of academic economics, and how can it change? How can it be better so it is relevant in today's world?
And basically, the only way to make it relevant in the real world is to throw out everything economists currently teach, because when you take a look at the state of neoclassical economics, it's intellectually contradicted itself by finding logical conundrums in their foundation ideas. It's been empirically contradicted. Events which weren't supposed to happen have happened with rather, well, I'd say exciting regularity in the real world rather than monotonous regularity. But it's a failed theory of economics. We should have thrown it out as much as a century ago, because the intellectual foundations were undermined at that stage. So if you study economics at a university, you'll learn what should be an obsolete theory that doesn't work in the real world, but is still taught because it ends up having ideological roles, more so for the people teaching it than the capitalist class, which I think, frankly, mainstream economics damages capitalism. But they love the model they teach because it describes capitalism as a self-equilibrating system that maximizes utility and minimizes costs. And that ends up being such a seductive vision of the economy that mainstream economists believe it, in the same sense that Christians believe that they believe in the virgin birth. And I don't know what, I can't quote any other religions. I didn't go through religious education as a Buddhist or a Muslim, but the belief system you've got there becomes just how you see the world. That's how it be. That's what I believe it must be. So I'll give my favorite example of why, one of my favorite examples of why neoclassical economics should have collapsed before by the 1920s, and that is that the vision that they had, the neoclassicals had, of the economy reaching what they called general equilibrium, was based on Volras' work, trying to build a model of a multi-commodity system where a process of trading led to equilibrium in every market. And that was based on Volras' model of the Paris Bourse. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but Paris has an institution called the Bourse, and the Bourse is a trading venue where there's a trading room for gold, there's a trading room for pigs, there's a trading room for flowers, etc., etc. And in each of them, there's an auctioneer appointed by the Bourse, and the role of the auctioneer is to declare an opening price and then see what the buying and the selling bids are for each of those markets. So you might start with yesterday's prices for flowers, and you get a price which means there's more supply of flowers than there is demand for flowers. So the auctioneer in that case would reduce the price to make it less attractive to supply, more attractive to demand, and keep on jiggling that individual price until you got supply equal to demand, and then trade occurs at that price. That's the way the Bourse apparently works, or did work. What Varro said is, let us imagine, and it's quite literally the opening phrase, of course, in French, in his principles, I think, elements of economics, I think Varro calls his book. So you imagine there's a single room where every commodity is traded, and everybody comes along with all those commodities at once, and there's a single auctioneer who then declares a vector of prices, because you've now got, say, 100 products inside the room. You therefore have 100 prices, and the initial price level is, as he said, cried at random. So some random vector, and you'd imagine that was yesterday's prices. This is equilibrium prices. You declare those prices, and then you see what the supply and demand is for every market: flowers, pigs, gold, etc., all the markets. Now, with that set of randomly declared prices, some markets might be in equilibrium, others would have too much supply, the others would have too much demand. So the auctioneer's role is to reduce the price where there's too much supply, increase the price where there's too much demand. And the algorithm that Volras dreamed up was that you would do that with the horizontal, the diagonal vector of supply and demand. Everything on the diagonal would be the demand for pigs from people who produce pigs, the demand from flowers and those who produce flowers, and so on. And he said, if you set the equilibrium to zero, then you will make sure that the own demand is zero for each of those markets. So you've got equilibrium. And then Volras reasoned, well, that's what happens on the horizontal vector. So you get you're in the market for pigs. You know that you see the price is too high. So there's too much supply, not enough demand. So you reduce the price towards the point at which supply will equal demand. And you do that across the diagonal. And he said, okay, that process in each market is going to drive each market towards equilibrium. But then you've got all the off element components. So the market for pigs will have an indirect effect on the market for flowers. So he said, for the actual individual prices, you've got the supply and demand curve for that market. You know that if the price is too high, there's too much demand, not enough supply. You reduce it, you know you're pushing that market towards equilibrium. But all the off-diagonal effects, maybe the the cause you do will make some markets move out of equilibrium, others will move closer to. And Volras verbally reasoned that the off-diagonal process, so the effect of driving equilibrium on the flour market, on all the other markets, he said some of the other market effects will cause an increase in demand, others will cause a decrease in demand, some will move further away from equilibrium, others move closer to. The plural saying okay, but I'm going to carry on in this answer. What you end up with is the off-diagonal ones cancel each other out. So they go some up, some down, some towards equilibrium, some away. Maybe they cancel each other out. The diagonal, they're all going in the right direction. So the diagonal will dominate, and over time you'll slowly converge on an equilibrium price for all the markets, which sets all of them in equilibrium. And then this is the final line in that critical part of Volras elements. And their market will supply will be equal to demand in every market, and then trade can take place. So this whole process is supposed to occur before trade actually occurs, and when trade does occur, all markets will be in equilibrium. Now, Volras, even though he's treated as a mathematical economist, he knew he wasn't really a mathematician. So he approached Henri Poincaré, who was obviously French and one of the world's great mathematicians, not just in his own time, but throughout time. And Poincaré, apparently quite arrogant and for good reason, basically told Volras, "No, I'm not going to tell you you're right. I don't know." Okay? So he wouldn't endorse Volras' mechanism. Now, there's mathematics is obviously an intellectual discipline in its own right. People are proving theorems all through time, adding more and more elements to mathematical knowledge. And in the early 1900s, one question that arose in pure mathematics was, what is what's called the dominant eigenvalue of a matrix, which is a positive semi-definite matrix? Now, translating that into English, if you have an array of numbers, a square array of numbers, where the entries are either 0 or greater than 0, you can reduce that to and then what they're basically saying is you're pushing things in all sorts of directions. You're pushing some directions, pulling in others. And you can specify that using what they call vectors, eigenvectors, that tell you which way you're pointing, and eigenvalues that tell you whether you're pushing away from the equilibrium or towards the equilibrium. And there'll be one, again, many mathematical theorems involved here, but they work out that one of the one of the pushes, which is the eigenvalues, will dominate all the others. It'll be larger than all the others. Now, they worked out that the dominant eigenvalue of a positive semi-definite matrix is greater than 0. And that's what's called the Perron-Frobenius theorem, named after the two mathematicians who independently reached the same result. I believe it was independently. And what that meant was, if you use Volras' model of the Bourse as a model of a production economy, which is what it has to be to make it realistic in the real world, then you produce units of output using 0 or positive components of all other commodities. You do not make iron by adding minus 35 flours to each ton of steel. You have 0. And so every element is in a production matrix is either 0 if you don't use flours to make iron ore, or positive. And what by being greater than 0, it meant that process that Volras was convinced would converge to equilibrium does not converge to equilibrium. So the response of economists, once they discovered that result, and it took until the 1960s that economists actually read the Perron-Frobenius theorem, you would hope their response would be, oh, that means that prices must be a non-equilibrium phenomenon. If you can't get equilibrium out of it, then the prices at which things to transact must have non-equilibrium elements to it. But by this stage, this is now the 1960s, the neoclassicals have gone from treating equilibrium as a crutch system used because they didn't have the technology to handle dynamics, which involves differential equations, to a belief about the actual nature of capitalism. And if they're suddenly sold that doesn't work in equilibrium, oh, that means it must be out of equilibrium transactions, and some people must gain more than they put in for a trade, if they get the advantage, and others must get a negative, and that's bad for welfare. Can't have that. So they argued that you could stabilize the process by changing people's behavior, which
So
is not at all socialist, of course. No, this is capitalism we're describing.
so you're essentially, so here's the funny thing is
Yeah,
sports bookies figured out what you're saying, long ago, since they've been, having sports lines. And basically, if a sports book took that theory where they just have their opening line, and they have an idea of what supply and demand is, so one team's better than the other, they just
yeah,
fix that line, and then they let that line run until the game's over, they would lose their shirts every time. And what happens in the real world is supply and demand, it moves through time and creates a price, so they're constantly adjusting the odds to each team, not based on the actual implied odds of the real world, but
yeah,
because of who's buying into each side. Um, and so there's no way, this is an example of a contained market where there's no way you figure out supply and demand first, then open the market, right? That's
yeah.
that's impossible. We're going to move on to the next question.
I'm,
I let Steve talk
I'll,
about.
I'll, yep. I'm just going to whack. I'm going to take a copy of the papers that point that out and put them in the chat. So,
Okay,
but
so
let's keep on chatting here anyway. Okay.
yeah,
Yep.
make
Yeah.
sure everybody you hit the like button, subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel. If you're on X, which there's about 400 of you there, come over to the YouTube feed. The X is just kind of like an advertising of the stream. A lot more interactive on the YouTube platform. It's just easier to use. So come over from there. Just go to Prof. Steve Keen on YouTube, and you'll find the stream. We have another we got a Bancor question. We'll probably be doing one of these each week, but it's from James. James says, is it possible to have a Bancor like arrangements, in brackets, to neutralize deficits and surpluses at a bilateral level or regional level, i.e. the European Union? I'm asking because a global implementation might be quite hard. Steve, your thoughts?
It's feasible. I mean, the point that Keynes made about bringing in the Bancor is that you don't want to have individual countries in balance with each other. This is one of the things you would have seen such intellectuals as Larry Summers rubbish about Trump, and at the time Musk's belief that you had to have balanced trade with each economy, and just rubbishing that point quite rightly. But Keynes's point was, what you want is aggregate balance, because the aggregate sum of all trade deficits is zero. Then you don't want to have balance with each country you're trading with, because it's just impossible. Countries like Saudi Arabia would be exporting lots of oil and could not import everything back from everybody. Countries like, what's one that suffered the most? I think it was Cambodia, that copped the highest increase in tariffs under Trump's crazy formula. They export as much as they can manage. They can import barely anything back because of the income just isn't high enough to be a major importer. So you don't want to get individual balance. You want to have collective balance. So overall, you might have a trade deficit being created by Cambodia, or obviously a trade surplus by Saudi Arabia. And in the aggregate, you would want all countries to have roughly a balanced trade with the whole rest of the world. I deliberately made it that's why I said intellectual. Summers is a bit of a contradiction in terms. But that's why the Bancor should work at a global level. Now, if you're a big enough region, you can sort of reduce that domestically. But ironically, the European Union, where you might imagine that sort of thing happening, that actually removed the capacity of countries to adjust their internal trade deficits, because before the euro came along, if Greece was running a trade deficit with Germany, then it would ultimately devalue the drachma, which would make it more expensive to import German goods and make Greek goods cheaper, and that would ultimately stabilize the trade between Greece and Germany. But with that being removed, there's no mechanism to control the balance of trade within the European Union. So only if the region itself is dedicated to trying to eliminate those trade imbalances would a regional version of the Bancor work. And of course, Europe's done anything like but that. So that's where, for a while, chronic trade surpluses for Germany corresponded to chronic trade deficits for Greece and Italy and a range of other countries, particularly Italy actually, because the adjustment mechanism they used to have by not having a single currency was removed by creating the single currency. And because Italy had a higher rate of inflation normally than Germany, then that high rate of inflation used to mean devaluation of the Italian lira against the German mark. But that was removed. So what you got is in the German-Italian case, you've got chronic trade surpluses for Germany and chronic trade deficits for Italy. And that's a major reason why Italy stopped advancing really when the euro began. So in that sense, it's quite dangerous, I think, to have something which is far less than the aggregate of the global economy. But the more you put in there, the more you, ultimately, if you continue adding countries to a global system like the Bancor, then ultimately you reach the point where the sum of all trade deficits within that group is zero by definition. And then you've got the potential, the stabilizing points that Keynes talked about could have been allowed to happen. But the euro was run to completely ignore that issue. And that's actually, I think, a large reason why, well, put it this way, the pact that introduced the euro, or the Maastricht Treaty, which introduced the controls on government spending, is called the Growth and Stability Pact. And it should be really called the Degrowth and Instability Pact, because that's what it achieved. Not hearing you, Ty.
There we go. Sorry.
I'm glad you made a glitch. It was me glitching last night, but not we were bloody turning up.
Yeah,
So
I wanted to be silent so everybody could hear your answer clearly. So I actually have kind of modeled it, and here's the thing: the way I do it. So I have
what are you modeling? I'll see the question. Here's that.
Okay, so Ty, I'd love to see your model the action of sports bookies. That would be fascinating. So I have tried it.
Okay.
I have tried it. So what I've learned with sports betting, so I do it for baseball. So right now going on in the regular season, and I do it for hockey in the winter. And what I found is you can't bet after the opening line. So that means you're actually betting the dynamics of different people with different emotions coming in and changing this sports line. So the sports bookie will always try to have an even amount of bettors on either side of the line. So for team A and team B, and of course their implied odds are always a few points above 100%, and they'll always win. They're the casino, they'll always win. You cannot my strategy, so anybody out there that wants to bet, I always go on the opening line. So when the lines first come out, because then I'm only competing against the model that the sports bookie uses, right? And I'm a great modeler, so I'm confident in my own modeling. And so I find the gap where, let's say, the underdog has, they're at 40% odds of winning, where my model shows no, they've got a good starting pitcher today and they're actually at 48% chance, right? And so I identify the gap and the potential there for me to make a winning. I'm betting on the underdog, I could win more money. But as soon as other people come in, other bettors come in, they start changing the odds because the sports book is adjusting it. And it is like tracking the stock market. So if you're a day trader, there is really no good way to forecast that. You can have some technicals, but technicals are just observations, right? They're not really rooted in the foundations of the structure. So I don't think it can be done. That's my answer for you. We're going to go to another question after you hit that like button. Let's just do it and get it out of the way. This is going to be the last time we address this. Douglas, a few people have asked it. Can Steve walk through his distinctions with MMT on trade? We're going to do this one last time, and that's it. Steve.
Well, I think that's a confident claim that I'm sure is going to be disproved by history. Okay, the starting point is that the thing I have immense respect for Warren Mosler for coming up with the argument that government doesn't tax to spend, it spends to tax, and that inverts the neoclassical belief that the government has to borrow to finance its debt. It says instead the government creates money by spending more than it takes back in taxation. That's how fiat money is created, and then the that actually generates money for the private sector. It's not taking money from it. It's creating money that the private sector then uses in general commerce. So running a deficit is a critical, essential part of creating fiat money. And if you're in a mixed fiat credit economy, which we all are, then you need the government to be running a deficit to create the fiat component of that money. So that's extremely sensible. It's not an original insight in the sense you can find similar things in earlier writers. You can go back and see the arguments made by the then chair of the Federal Reserve. Thinking of Eccles here in the 1940s after the experience of the Second World War, and that was a paper called "Taxes for Spending is Obsolete." And it's not Eccles. I'm trying to remember the name, but that was Beardsley Rummel, RUML. So Beardsley Rummel in 1946, I think it was, published a paper called "Taxes for Spending are Obsolete," and he pointed out that the experience that the American administrators and had during the Second World War was that the government created the money that actually financed the war. It was not a case of borrowing money from the public to enable the war to happen. Even people like Charlie Chaplin, who was involved in selling those bonds to the public, realized that the reason the bonds are being sold is not to raise the money, but to take money out of circulation that had been created by government spending and might otherwise have caused a shortage of essential goods, like, for example, silk, because you could have had people buying silk for silk stockings rather than leaving the silk to be used to make parachutes. That's why you sold the bonds, to take demand out of the private sector and mean as much as possible as the productive capability of the American economy went into making the elements of war, the ships and guns and tanks and so on, and paying for the work of the soldiers as well. That's what you did with the taxes. You reserve by boosting demand, by the government paying for munitions, paying for tanks and so on, that increased the amount of money. If you didn't control it, you get inflation. That's what happened in World War I. So to some extent, the realization that they had to sell bonds came out of the World War I experience, where there was substantial inflation. Now, if you look then at World War II, what happened in World War II, there was twice as much money creation and half the rate of inflation. So the bond selling was there to dampen consumer demand and enable an inflationary surge to not occur during World War II. So what Warren has done with saying that government doesn't tax to spend, it spends to tax, that resuscitated the insight that Rummel and other people had at the time, and it's a novel introduction. I've got all the time in the world for it, as you can see. But he also came up with this line that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. And when I saw that, I was firstly in shock that it was being proposed as an explanation for what you should do for your trade balance, that the bigger the trade deficit, the better, which is what you'll find in Mosler's 7 Deadly Frauds, literally that statement: the bigger the trade deficit, the better. That is making the same mistake that the neoclassicals make, to think that allocation of resources at a point in time gives you the best development process over time. So that the neoclassicals don't argue in favor of trade surpluses, so trade deficits is a good thing. They believe that the price mechanism will mean that if any country running a trade deficit is forced to devalue, those running a surplus revalue through a floating exchange rate, and that will get rid of all trade deficits. Well, that's garbage. We know it's 50 years that hasn't happened. But the MMT argument is that running a trade deficit is a good idea because exports are a cost, imports are a benefit. The logic being that to make a good for export, you've got to have workers and productive machinery and raw materials, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're the reserve currency, which America is, of course, you can create the money that's used to buy those exports. And there's no production process involved in creating money. You have the accounting structure that generates the creation of money, and by the government, that's just deciding to run a deficit, and that means you can create like $1 trillion worth of money, which you could use to import $1 trillion worth of goods, and you'll come out ahead because it's really easy for you to make the money and really hard to make the goods. So you gain, and that's pretty much the argument in modern monetary theory. And I've I know how strongly people believe this thing. And that to me is a sign of how humans can just fall for something put forward by a guru or a dominant attitude in a research paradigm. Um, it just doesn't work, okay, as a development process, because what that's pretty much saying is if you do what maximizes your returns in a point in time, that is a great development strategy over time. So my little satirical send-up on that is to say that, well, if I look at maximizing utility at a point in time, I get more utility lying in a beanbag, drinking good wine, getting stoned and listening to good rock and roll than I do by going to the gym. So my development strategy, therefore, is to lie in a beanbag every day, drinking wine and getting stoned and listening to music. And in 30 years' time, I'll look like a bloody beanbag. Okay. If you want to have a decent body, you go to the damn gym. Thanks very much. Maybe one day in every 4 you do the beanbag routine, but 3 out of 4 you go and damn well exercise. That's the development process over time. So the foundation of what the modern monetary theory crowd think, courtesy of Warren's completely different argument about foreign trade to his argument over money creation, is that they're saying that what maximizes your utility effectively at a point in time is the best development process over time. And that is what's called the ergodic fallacy. The fallacy of believing that what gives you the best return at a point in time can be used as a guide to what's to do through time. Now, this gets to be quite complicated to explain, and I'm going to be working, Ty doesn't know this yet, I think you do, we're going to work together to produce a dynamic model of trade rather than the neoclassical static equilibrium nonsense. But the example that I'm going to use from Ole Peter's work on ergodic economics is that if you were presented with a gamble where you have a choice of either putting $100 down, on a coin toss, and if the coin toss ends up being heads, you get 150. If it's tails, you get 60. That at a point in time, if you can spread that $100 over 100 gambling tables at a casino, and you have 100 tosses of the coins, then roughly speaking, 50 of the tables are going to come out giving you $1.50, and then 50 the table's going to giving you 60 cents, and you add up 50 times $1.50 plus 50 times 60 cents, you get $105, $5 gain. Yeah, you should take that gamble. That's the point in time, effectively ergodic assumption that what maximizes your returns at a point in time will maximize your returns through time. Now, if you do actually take that gamble, you can't go to well, maybe you can, you're from stupid casinos somewhere, but you can't spread your bets over a whole table. And that's not an analogy of what we do in investment anyway, which is where these ideas come from. They're saying, what's the investment strategy? Well, if you take that in a dynamic sense and you put $100 down and then you gamble whatever your proceeds are out of each gamble and keep on going, again, roughly speaking, you're going to get 50 heads and 50 tails. Let's imagine you just happen to throw 50 consecutive heads and tail pairs. So heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, ultimately 100 tosses, 50 heads, 50 tails. On the first toss, you're going to get heads, so you turn the 100 and 150. Yay, party. Second toss, you're going to get tails. 60% of 150 is $90. So after 2 tosses, you've turned your 100 into 90. And then another 2 tosses, you turned your 90 into 81. Keep on going, and after 100 tosses, you'll turn your $100 into 72 cents. So rather than being a sensible strategy based on what maximizes your return at a point in time, and then saying we can apply that as development strategy over time, you end up with virtually nothing. That's where casinos work to take money away from people who make that calculation and fall for it. And I think it's just a wrong-headed analysis of what's a good development strategy. And it pains me that I've got to take MMT on this front, but I've seen what happens when you don't fight a stupid idea in an otherwise good philosophical foundation over time. The stupid idea stays and perverts everything else. And that's what I'm seeing happening with the trade issue. So having not taken it on for 20 years of being aware of this and 10 years aware of the MMT argument of why it was wrong, now I think it's time to take it on, because MMT is big enough, I hope, to stand up for itself on its good argument. It can hopefully survive having its bad argument trashed, which is what I intend doing in the next year.
Good stuff. What do we got here? Here's a good one, and Steve will have a great option here. It is from Fairs. Can you provide us with a roadmap to learn economics the right way? I'm currently self learning, and since I've joined your channel, everything you've said makes sense. Thank you for your time and effort. Steve, I do believe you have a program out there that can help people like Fairs quite a bit. Tell us about it.
Well, there's several programs. I mean, one is that the program itself is called Ravel these days, and you can get Ravel from Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/Ravelation, not Revel, R-E-V, but Ravel, R-A-V-E-L-ation, you get a copy of Ravel, which you can use for your own modeling on this front, and you can learn an enormous amount from that alone. I have two. I'm just putting the link to Ravel inside the chat there. I've also written a few books which are already in existence. So one is Debunking Economics, and that's I wrote that fundamentally to save people the pain and effort I had to go through to learn what was wrong with mainstream economics and what the alternatives were. I wrote that back, first of all, in 2000, published in 2001. Then I made a major re-edition in 2010-11. And now I hope to actually write a third edition. I sort of keep on saying starting this year, but it's probably going to be next year. So Debunking Economics is a useful roadmap on that sense. I've written a positive version, which I called The New Economics and Manifesto. And that is a much shorter book than Devo. It's actually, I think, a 20,000 word or 25,000 word book. Debunking Economics is pretty close to 250,000 words. So Manifesto is much shorter. And that gives you a positive alternative, how you could build economics from the ground up. And then I'm now, and I publish a lot of that, the work on that, and on my two blogs. So I have patreon.com/ProfSteveKeen. And then I've got a Substack, which is profstevekeen.substack.com. So I publish my work there. But I'm also giving an online course now. Now, that online course has some rather weird looking marketing that you might not think comes from me. And you're right, I didn't write the marketing, but it does lead to a course by me. And that's got about of the order of 600 people in one course, 1,000 in another, who've signed up. And I give these lectures weekly on a Wednesday, 1 p.m. New York time, and a Thursday, 6 p.m. Sydney time, both of which I can give from where I live at the moment in Amsterdam. And that's a solid 60 lectures over a year, introduction to my approach to economics based on both critiques of neoclassical economics, but also what I've learned myself from post-Keynesians, evolutionary economists, complex systems people, and so on. So that's the best way to get a very intense introduction to a realistic approach to economics with a great audience. I must say I thoroughly enjoy the course because I interact with a great group of people that have themselves a great conversation on the school site, and I want to see more of that happen. One thing I've done with the work I've put together, building an alternative approach to economics, is I wrote a book that I wrote initially to give to Elon Musk, and it's called Money and Macroeconomics from First Principles for Elon Musk and Other Engineers. So that's I'm getting that. I'm self-publishing that. One of my school students, so to Kirk, is a New Zealand guy. First name is Nick. Nick is currently desktop publishing that for self-publishing by me on Kindle, and that'll be available hopefully in the next month or so. We'll also give it away for free to anybody who signs up to the school course. But that is actually on my Substack and Patreon pages right now. It's there as a free manuscript to download. So I'll just actually give the link to that in the chat as well. And I'm giving it away for free. I want to get the ideas out there as well as possible. I hope anybody who reads it for free will also buy the published version when it comes out. But that's immediate answer to your question. How can you learn an alternative approach to economics?
Question for Ty. I didn't get your model against corporate income taxes. Countries like France and Germany achieved good growth rates in the 60s with top corporate tax rates of around 40 to 60%. Now, I'm not too sure when I made the comment, but I always do nuance corporate taxes and the difference between corporate taxes against financial institutions and businesses and firms and non financial institutions, businesses, and firms. So I'm highly against, even if they're at the corporate level and they're selling shares and the CEOs are making big money, I'm highly against taxing their profits, right? And why I'm against that is because it's a cost to a business. If you increase the cost of the business, your after tax profits are less. That business will invest less into productive capacities of their own firms, and thus you have less output and then less employment. So I haven't looked at the data for France and Germany in the 60s, but I imagine those corporate tax rates were probably more emphasized on the financial institutions in those countries at the time as opposed to the productive ones at the time. I'm much more in favor, if we're going to do taxes, as actually just tax the household more. And I know that sounds heartless, but household consumption, which is a component of GDP, it's a stable over time. So taxing it is not that disruptive to the system as a whole. So if you want to extract what fiat money you've put into the system as a government, it's best to probably target households, because they're not. This sounds again heartless, but I'm looking at it from a systems perspective. They're not the productive feature of the economy. Now, I'm not saying tax the hill out of them by any means, but so to really nuance that, I specifically mean, I don't agree with taxing productive firms, whether they're corporate or proprietary firms. Productive firms, an awful lot, because that's actually very restrictive and disruptive to the economic system. If that kind of answers your question. To the next one, what do we got here? Okay, here's an interesting one from Tobias. What is your take on the ordinal utility theory? Could we come up with something better? Steve, this is stuff I don't study, but I know it has to do with utils and a bunch of bunk theory. So, Steve, answer this question.
Well, that's actually a fascinating question in terms of how it exposes the way in which neoclassical economists use good ideas. They fuck them up because you would have heard of von Neumann and Morgenstern and the theory of games and economic behavior. And that was von Neumann, who's one of the world's great geniuses. Again, somebody you'd rank with Poincaré and Einstein as just an outrageously intelligent human being. And he and Morgenstern got involved in the theory of games at some point. And this has been taken as a basis by neoclassical economists, what they call expected utility theory. And what they did was take the concepts about how you calculate, how you maximize utility or work out game theoretic equilibria outcomes, the sort of stuff that Nash got the Nobel Prize in economics for. You use games as a way of talking about how people will behave to maximize their utility, and therefore you get Pareto, what they call Pareto optimal outcomes, where it's not the best situation for everybody, but you don't get the best situation, but you get the best situation given everybody else's reaction. The sort of stuff you can see in that movie, A Beautiful Mind, about Nash's own work. So that's the way that neoclassicals have used it, to say that you can see how people maximize utility. They're still talking about utility being ordinal as opposed to cardinal. Now that's what they think is the only thing you can do, because they say, how can you possibly work out a numerical value for utility? Well, John Neumann, being his head of genius and somebody who measures all the time, anybody in physics, you're always measuring, your different units of your systems and so on. He just couldn't stomach this idea that you can't turn utility into something cardinal. And ordinal means you rank things by, you get you can rank how much utility you get something out of this. You get more utility out of oranges than you get out of apples, for example. But you can't say you're getting a certain number of utils out of apples and a number of utils out of bananas and add them up. You can't do that. Well, von Neumann and Morgenstern, I'm sure it's more von Neumann than Morgenstern, in their book, work that out in the introductory chapter. They work that away that you get a cardinal ranking of utility. And they said the fact that economics still uses a ordinal ranking just shows how primitive economics is. We used to talk about being hot and cold, and now we have the Celsius scale for calculating whether one thing is hotter than another or not, but actually giving numbers to how hot they are. So what they came up with in their system was a way that you can convert the probability of somebody accepting a gamble into a cardinal utility ranking. And I mean, I'm now going usual. I give a long-winded answer here, but what they did was just imagine you have 0. Well, that's going to give you 0 utils. Okay, then you have 1 banana, for example, and the question is, what probability you can then give the 1 banana a ranking of 1 util. So 1 banana gives the consumer 1 util, this particular individual consumer. Then you offer the consumer a gamble of 2 bananas versus 0 bananas, and then you work out. Let's say they're willing to take that gamble on. If you get an 80% chance of getting the 2 bananas and a 20% chance of getting 0. You can then convert that into a numerical estimate of the util for the second banana. So that second banana might give you 0.7 util. So you get 1 util out of the first and 0.7 out of the second, and so on. And so they worked out a way to create a cardinal theory of utility. Now, neoclassicals completely ignored that and instead used the idea of game theory and using games to approximate people's behavior, still working with ordinal utility. So ordinal utility, this is probably the ultimate flaw of neoclassical economics, because they built a lovely model of a single individual. And as soon as they try to aggregate, when they've got ordinal utility rankings, they can't add up, and they end up with a theory which cannot be moved beyond one individual. And that's the great weakness of the neoclassical concept, starting with a subjective theory of value, ruling out the possibility of turning it into something cardinal. We can actually add up utils in that sense. When they try to aggregate, the only way they can aggregate is if they assume, first of all, that all consumers are the same, and secondly, that all commodities are the same. And so they end up having a model, elaborate looking model, massive, elements of mathematics in it, and it looks really sophisticated. It works with one consumer consuming one thing. It fails when you try to go beyond that scale, and they continue pretending to themselves that wasn't the case.
Great stuff. Let's do a Marx question here.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that one there. Okay.
Yes. Could you please give a rigorous example of why you think the labor theory of value is wrong, especially about machines not being able to produce value, Steve?
Okay. Well, the simple answer to that is that the only way that it's true that machines can't create value, according to Marx's philosophical logic, which he worked out long after he became a devotee of the labor theory of value, is if the contribution that a machine makes to production is identical to what it loses in depreciation. So that's the condition under which machines can add no value. Now, when Marx first wrote his arguments on economics, he was working with a straight labor theory of value. He read Smith and he read Ricardo, and officially he hated them. Has a fascinating, very small book called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. And he wrote those in Paris, I think literally in what you might call a garret, while he was deciding that everything he learned about philosophy didn't help him understand why the enclosure movement happened in Germany and peasants were being thrown out of the Black Forest, not allowed to use their feudal rights to go to those forests instead. He realized he didn't understand the economic system. He had a strong philosophical foundation, having been trained by the successors to Hegel, but he couldn't understand what has happened economically. So he decided he had to learn economics, and then in a French, when he got expelled from Prussia to France, that's where he read the English political economist. Initially, he hated the commodification of human beings that was applied by the labor theory of value, but ultimately he said that makes complete sense to him now. So he really dropped his philosophical foundations and became what Samuelson later sent up as a Ricardian socialist. And if you look at Ricardo and Smith, neither of them could explain where profit came from. Smith at one point talks about how in that what he called early and rude state of society, before there's been accumulation of capital in the hands of individuals, the pre-capitalist system, he said the only basis on which things will be exchanged is the amount of effort that it takes to produce them. So if it takes twice as much labor to kill a beaver as it does to kill a deer, then one beaver will exchange for two deer. That was the early and primitive state of society. But once you have capital being accumulated by individuals, so they hire workers, you no longer have labor is not the only social class that is trying to sell. The capitalists are selling as well in that system. And to quote Smith, something must be given for the profits. Literally something. He had no explanation. Neither did Ricardo. So what the logic that Marx worked out initially is that everything in the classical school of thought, everything exchanged at its cost of production. So the question is, how can you buy stuff at the cost of production and sell it at the cost of production and still make a profit? And Marx's initial explanation was that applies to labor as well. Labor is a unique commodity where what you buy is labor, the capacity of people to work in a factory. But what you're paying for to get that labor is labor power, which is the capacity to work. And the capacity to work is created by consuming a subsistence bundle of commodities. So you pay the worker a subsistence bundle of commodities. The worker is then required to work in your factory for the length of the working day. Now, Marx said, let's hypothesize that it takes 6 hours of labor to make the means of subsistence for a worker, and then you've hired that worker for 12 hours on the working day, because that's what the contract allows. So you pay 6 hours of their labor time to reproduce the means of subsistence. The other 6 hours they work for you according to the contract goes to the capitalist. That's surplus value, which is the source of profit. That's the explanation that Marx used. And then what that means is the source of profit is exploiting labor. Now, Marx was careful to say it's not particularly exploitation in the sense that labor is treated the same way as every other commodity. All commodities are produced using inputs that are sold at their cost of production and sold. But said this is the only one with the gap between commodity and commodity power, and that's the source of profit. Now, in 1857, long sequence as to why, and I write this up in my master's thesis. I'll put the link to that in the chat. Marx revisited Hegel and started using Hegelian philosophical concepts as a way of understanding the economics, and suddenly worked out the idea of there being a contradiction between use value and exchange value in a capitalist economy. So he said, in a capitalist economy, people purchase things for their use value and pay for them at their exchange value. And that's a general rule that applies to every input, not just labor. So he said, you buy a chair for its use value. In fact, you can sit in it. Hey, I'm rocking out of the way here, doing my usual move around game. And you pay for the cost of production. So the use value is qualitative, while exchange value is quantitative. But you look at the capitalists exactly the same way. Capitalists buy for the use value they get out of something. What's that use value? It's selling things for a profit. So in the case of what Marx called the cycle of production, the use value the capitalists get out of anything they buy is quantitative. It's the actual amount of stuff it produces you can sell. They also buy the inputs for their exchange value, which is necessarily quantitative. You get a gap between the use value and the exchange value of inputs to production, and that's where profit comes from. Now, that becomes an argument not about the specific unique characteristics of labor, but an argument about the characteristics that labor shares with all other commodities. And Marx says that in Capital Volume 1, I think page 196 of the Progress Push edition from my memory. That then means that if you apply that to labor, you get workers are hired at their exchange value, which is the cost of production, subsistence. They exploit their use value, which is the fact you can make them work for 12 hours rather than 6. Use value greater than exchange value, source of profit. You apply exactly the same logic to a machine. You buy the machine for its cost of production. You exploit its use value, which is his capacity to produce commodities for sale. They're incommensurable in Marx's philosophical scheme. A sensible capitalist will only buy a machine if its use value exceeds its exchange value. That is a source of profit. Now, Marx himself realized that when he first developed this argument. You can find it in the Grundrisse, where he first developed the argument. It was on page 266 to 267, I think it was, or 67 to 68 of the Penguin edition of the Grundrisse. And he actually then dramatically excited by his discovery. 60 or 70 pages of handwritten notes to say what the development is. And at one point he does a few examples where he has labor being the only source of value in the system. And then he talks about machinery. And then he says, it also has to be postulated, which was not done above, that the use value of the machine greater than its supply exchange value. He left out the word is. So exchange value, use value greater than exchange value. That is, the contribution of the machine to production is greater than its depreciation. Now, if he'd worked that through, he would have said machines are also a source of profit, of surplus value, and then ultimately profit. That would have meant that there's no tendency for the rate of profit to fall. That would mean that the person who styled himself as a scientific socialist had scientifically shown that socialism was not inevitable. And if you read those particular pages of the Grundrisse, you can see Marx struggling with this basically holy shit dilemma. Here I am, have improved out of sight the logical foundations. I've gone from just this unique characteristics of commodity and non-philosophical foundation of Ricardo and Smith to a highly philosophical foundation with a general principle about use value and exchange value. And oh my God, I've proven that it looks like capitalism and it doesn't have to decay into socialism. So he then spent dozens of pages reworking his argument until such point he convinced himself that the use value of a machine is precisely equal to exchange value, and therefore there's no profit that can come out of it. But of course, that contradicted his own logic. So what he saw as his major contribution was that that capitalism, that he had a philosophical foundation to explain use value and exchange value being independent and incommensurable. He saw that as huge philosophical extension, and he buried it by reaching the same result as the labor theory of value. So the number of people who actually understand Marx on that front, you can literally count on one hand. I'm on there as well. So is Rostolsky, who's the first person to seriously look at the Grundrisse. To some extent, you can also find that in Hilferding, and Hilferding actually understood Marx on that front. But the vast majority still think about Marx in terms of the labor theory of value, and Marxists in that sense have been an intellectual waste of time. Muted again, Ty.
Sorry. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just, I don't want to cough or anything like that and interrupt Steve. The one thing I have to admit is I don't know. I basically surface level stuff about Marx. So the class structure struggle between capitalists and workers. But beyond that, I don't know an awful lot. So it's very interesting to hear that perspective. But we're going to keep rolling along with questions here. Remember, hit that like button. If you're watching, subscribe so you can see this live stream each week.
What's the other one? You got to hit the bell, the
notification bell.
Notifications. Yeah, that actually has a huge impact upon the algorithm. So the more you do that, the more this video is going to be promoted, and the more people will get on the whole show. So please hit the like, subscribe, and notifications.
There you go. Steve has become a Gen Z social media promoter. He has arrived. It is a special time in this world. Next
Without
question.
Jordan's help, Jordan Heather would never have got there. But anyway, we'll see.
Well, I have to say, you're getting videos from 100,000 to 500,000 views now. That's pretty freaking impressive. So he's done a good job.
He has done a good job.
Despite maybe what seems to be unorthodox marketing to the academic community is probably just the norm on social media, and he's kind of target that really well. So it's quite impressive.
I just seen a comment on TK there. I disagree that use value and exchange value can be quantitatively compared, but useful explanation nonetheless. take a look in capital, and you will find at one point that Marx says that use value and exchange value in the circle of production are two incommensurable magnitudes. Okay, Marx actually uses the word magnitude. That can only be if they're quantitative. There's no such thing as a qualitative magnitude. So Marx himself realized that that's why it's so important.
All right. Well, let's get into some class struggle here with a question from Danny. How do you make sure new money isn't concentrated in the hands of the already wealthy? Why doesn't money creation always lead to inflation? There's a few questions in that.
Yeah.
I could go off right now, but Steve, I'm going to let you handle it. Go
Well,
ahead.
let's go for the second one first, Ty, because this just turns up so many times, and it shows how much the neoclassical belief that that money doesn't matter and money is just a veil over barter, and it sets the price level, and you don't want to have you want to have equilibrium, so you don't want to have too much money creation, but their models are always static. They don't have time in them. If you look on the horizontal axis of a supply and demand curve, it's quantity, not quantity through time. The price is priced at a point in time. It's not priced through time. So in effect, what you've got with a supply and demand curve is like a slice through time, and there's the third axis of time that isn't even considered. Now, if you look at capitalism's history, it's always been a system where the tendency is towards growth. And we can have a bit of a chat about why that's the case. But capitalism is a growing system. If you have a growing system and you have a monetary unit of account, you need the number of units of account that exist, which is the role that money plays, to grow with the economy. So the question isn't why doesn't money creation always lead to inflation? It's why does money creation in excess of the rate of real economic growth cause rising prices for those commodities? So this is, I'm actually being distracted by some of the new questions as I answer each of the questions. So pardon me looking a bit puzzled on occasions. I'm trying to read a question, keep it in mind before I go to the next one. But fundamentally, if you have a growing economy, you need a growing money supply. So the question isn't why does money creation lead to inflation? It's why does money creation in excess of the rate of real economic growth lead to inflation? So you need the money creation. It's got to be in there in the first instance. And so that's the second question. Money creation is an essential part of a growing capitalist economy. Whether we're going to continue growing into the future is a totally different question. But to have that growing physical output, you needed a growing money supply as well. Austrians fantasize you can have a falling money supply and a growing physical economy. That will work if you don't have any debt. Okay, so rule that one out because we have a monetary system which generates money by creating debt. And if you have deflation in that situation, you potentially have the Great Depression all over again as falling prices bankrupt people because they no longer have the money supply to be able to finance their debt with a falling price level. So when you have debt in the economy, and that's when you have capitalism, then you can't have falling prices and rising output at the same time. Virtually every time you had falling prices, you had falling output as well. Now, the important point in that, like the intellectually interesting question is the one, how do you be sure that new money isn't concentrated in the hands of the already wealthy? That's probably the biggest mistake we're making right now because the money creation ends up money creation is one thing. Taking money out of the system largely occurs through taxation. If the rich can avoid paying tax, which they do, they manage to, put um, their they use offshore tax havens and things of that nature to reduce their tax liabilities, which the rest of us can't see. It's not so much the money starts off in the hands of the wealthy; it's that it ends up going to everybody's hands, but it's only taken out of the poor and the middle class. And therefore, the rich accumulate that money by minimizing their tax liabilities. And that's one of the reasons that Gary Stevenson's ideas about taxing wealth are extremely important because the only people with wealth are the rich. If you tax them, and it's harder to hide wealth than it is to hide income. So that might be a more successful way of going about it. But I would also, we look at how do you create new money. And there's two ways you create your money in a domestic economy. One is the government spends more than it takes back in taxation. That creates fiat money. The other is that banks lend out more than they get back in repayments. That creates credit-based money. we used to give banks that responsibility because only banks could go through and assess the creditworthiness of people applying for a loan. But banks get very conservative about losing that money if they give it to somebody who's might go bankrupt. So they tend not to fund entrepreneurs, when what we'd actually get benefit out of in terms of causing capitalism to innovate more and physically grow more as well is getting it to entrepreneurs. And we now have, with crowdfunding, with all the flaws that crowdfunding has, that may be a better way of allocating that initial money than going through banks. So I would like to see what would happen if we had a system where everybody was given a certain amount of money by the government, and then that money was only given to you to be used to invest it in ideas put forward by entrepreneurs. And we might get the wisdom of the crowds, meaning we give money in a more sensible way than banks themselves do, because banks easily fall into the trap of lending into the most popular thing right now, and you get bubbles and crashes caused by banks over investing, as they did in Texas in oil rigs in 1980 after the price rose from $10 a barrel to 40, and they all got wiped out when the price fell back from 40 back to 5, I think it was. So you might get more intelligence out of the crowd and less trapped into bubbles than we get with letting banks create that credit-based money.
Great stuff. We just talked about oil here. We've got an oil question. Here it is. Prof. Steve, what economic model should a third world country follow, taking into account that it has recently become a petro state?
Yeah, I think the classic element there is the opposite of what used to be called the Dutch disease. If you're going to become a petro state, your exports of oil are going to mean that your currency, you're going to run a trade surplus, your currency is going to appreciate because of that. That's going to then make it harder for you to do other services, have other goods produced, because your price level is going to rise. And you're going to then disadvantage your manufacturing sector and your services sector if they're also competing on the global market. So the best thing to do would be to use that excess surplus, tax it, because this is money you're making from overseas, tax it and put that into a reinvestment funds in your other sectors of your economy, your education sector in particular, also your agricultural sector, your services sector, and use taxation to redirect that money so it turns up as something you can invest to buy the capital goods you might need to bring them over and establish your own capabilities. Basically, use that export surplus to industrialize and then raise the educational level of your people. And that's what China's been doing for the last 40 years on bloody steroids. And consequently, China's annual rate of per capita economic growth, not just the nation state, which of course involves the effect of population change as well, but per capita rate of economic growth has over the last 40 years fluctuated quite a bit, but it's averaged 8% a year. Now, that's just incredible, because if you want to convert a rate of growth into a rate of a length of time it takes you to double per capita income, you divide that number, the growth rate, into 72, and that's what's called the law of 72. It can also be the law of 69 if you're working continuous time and happen to be a so-called rocket engineer. That's how it tells you how long it's going to take to double. So 8 into 72 gives you roughly 8.5, 9 years. So it means over a 9-year period, the per capita income of China has doubled. Now you had 4 consecutive decades where that's coming up towards 5 decades now. So you get, first of all, after less than a decade, per capita incomes have doubled in China. Then they're 4 times what they were when you started. Then they're 8, then they're 16, then they're 32. So over a 50-year period, effectively, the average income of China has increased by a factor of 50. Now, if you take a look at America, which is running a trade deficit, of course, the rate of per capita growth in America for the same time period is 1.7% per annum. Now, that's still fairly high, and that's high in global standards, certainly over human history. It's only under the capitalist period that you've seen positive per capita growth over time being sustained. But you divide 1.7 into the 72, you get about 40. So it means even if we had an even distribution of income, which we have not had at all in America, of course, the income's been screwed towards the wealthy. The average, the capita income has increased every 40 years. So over time, when China's per capita wealth has risen by a factor of 30 or 40, America's doubled. And that's why China is hands and away far ahead of America in terms of the rate of technological development and economic development. So you reinvest that trade surplus in your own manufacturing sector, and the Chinese have done that on steroids, and you can see the success that it had. Mind you, if you're going to try to do it now, you're now got to beat China as well as beating America. Beating America is no great problem. Beating China is difficult.
So we've got Tom Meow here. He says it's a low priority question, but what's wrong with being a raw materials exporter without a value added process? Now, I've discussed this before. So, if a country has no utility itself domestically, let's say for oil, and there's utility in other countries, exporting that raw value to get US dollars that then used to purchase other things abroad on the market has immense utility for that country. And at face value, I would suggest exporting that raw material with no value added is perfectly fine. But obviously, there's political implications when larger company or countries then impose some sort of political will on that country to always export that raw material, then things can arise. So that's kind of my opinion on it. But Steve, I know you can offer a much deeper nuance to it.
I can give some nice examples there because that's of course what happened to the oil states. They were I've forgotten. I think oil's first discovered what we now call British Petroleum (BP), in terms of it's discovered in the Arab states, and they then set up the oil because it was the experts on oil mining. Of course, they were the ones who set up the oil rigs and so on, and exported the oil. Of course, they exported it inside their own corporate structures. So British Petroleum oil in Saudi Arabia was sold to British Petroleum or transferred to British Petroleum and sold in the rest of the world. And the price they paid for oil coming out of Saudi Arabia was $2.50 a barrel. And that, if you take a look at the price history of oil, you'll see that from pretty much the night, there's no point taking the data during World War II. It's a bit crazy because of the war effort and everything was administered and controlled. But from 1945 to 1970, roughly 1975, 73, the price of oil was $2.50 a barrel. Now, when the Yom Kippur War occurred and the Israelis defeated their Arab potential invaders at the time in 6 days, the 6-day war, the response of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the OPEC, was to put an embargo on any country which had supported Israel during that war, which of course included America. So the oil price jumped from $2.50 a barrel to 10. Now, it's been all over the place ever since. So we've now got a floating price for the oil price as much as I think $160 a barrel, as low as $5 over that intervening 50 years or so. But that's where the wealth has come from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and all the Arabic countries that have oil reserves. So they've done brilliantly by just exporting the raw material, but they've used that to raise the technological level of their countries in various ways. I mean, the main thing is they've imported a lot of cheap labor from the rest of the world. Nobody in not quite nobody in Saudi Arabia works for a living, but most of the work in Saudi Arabia is not done by Saudi Arabians. So they've benefited enormously out of that. But you've got to have a resource which is absolutely critical for the rest of the world. Now, if you cut off the supply of pistachios, you're not likely to bring the world economy to a halt. You cut off the supply of oil, the world economy is crippled. So there's enormous political power in that particular resource. And to mention one other resource which has the same effects, can you think of any other resource, Ty, which there's one country or a handful of countries that have a virtual monopoly on, which is absolutely critical for the world economy? Have a guess? And turn your mic back on.
I had a really good joke there. It's ruined now. I was going to say Canadian maple syrup, but
Oh, that's pretty good. That's funny. Okay. Try superphosphate. You know the story about superphosphate? There's one country, I think, is responsible for 83% of the world's exports of superphosphate. Now, if you don't have superphosphate, you don't have a human population either, because the Haber-Bosch process, which converts both oil and nitrogen into superphosphate, fertilizing for plants, that was discovered by the same guy who created mustard gas for the Germans in World War I. Okay. He thought he'd end up going to jail for his work. He ended up getting the Nobel Prize for chemistry instead. And I've seen estimates, again, I'm not an agronomist, so I don't know this for sure, but I've seen estimates that we weren't using superphosphate to produce food output, the carrying population of the planet would be roughly 1 billion people. So more than 7 billion of us depend upon exports from Morocco of superphosphate, and they get a shithouse price for it. So I'd advise the Moroccan government, if you wanted to start really developing the Moroccan economy, start using resource depletion pricing on your the superphosphate deposits, and price them so that you delay the exhausting the resource. You're the monopoly, virtually monopoly in the global system. You could charge virtually whatever price you want for superphosphate for getting the phosphate as input to making superphosphate. So that would be a dramatic way of increasing the revenue of Morocco. And there's the only alternative is at some point maybe the Norwegians will develop that very deep mineral deposit they've found of phosphate, and that might give you the competition. But you've got, Morocco could win very heavily by just exporting superphosphate and then using it to build up the entire economy.
Yeah, that Norway deposit is promising, but the intensity of capital to actually do
Reach
it
it.
is it's massive, and it's damaging to the environment. And as we all know, exponential curves, you don't know until you're shooting up. So that deposit actually might not last very long at the end of the day. But that is a promising one, I guess. Mr. Mick Flash, not Mr. Flash, Mick Flash. I hope you're just that's a
McFlash.
name.
Jumping
You're
Jack
not.
McFlash. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
keep that trench coat closed. Hey Steve, do you think the UAE is the best economic model in the world? Zero income tax, free markets except for oil, low corporate tax, no VAT, and increasing amounts of entrepreneurs are moving there. That's kind of an extension of what we were just talking about. Anything to add on to, the success of the UAE?
Well, I mean, the trouble is they're using a commodity which is increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the planet, and there's a use-by date for that particular phenomenon. So it's a good model while it lasts. The trouble is it's causing global warming. So I know global warming skeptics can leave this channel now, but that's the basic dilemma. But yeah, they're doing brilliantly because they've got a commodity the rest of the world needs. That they are one of the handful of virtual monopoly suppliers of. They make money out of that. They're not taxing their own people. I mean, because they're importing a huge amount of the commodities they buy, then they're not getting the domestic inflation dynamic out of that either. So they don't necessarily have to tax that money out of existence, hence the zero income tax, no VAT as well. And the entrepreneurs,
Hold on.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hey, D. Bruce, goodbye. If the whole climate thing is too much for
Oh,
you,
good. He's gone, has he? Okay. Bye,
see you
Bruce.
later, buddy.
See you, Bruce.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Carry on, Steve.
So that took the wind out of his sails and mine. We were answering the one about the oil markets. Okay. Yeah, it's a brilliant scheme. And like the attempt, the bad thing about taxation, MMT talks about tax giving value to money, but it ends up being a real negative for I think in the political sense. I think it's a large part of why the public has turned right wing over the last 20 or 30 years, because you can see the tax coming out of your own bank account. You can't see how government spending and excessive taxation is adding money, actually more money than it's taking out of your system. So I think a huge part of the negative swing is because of income tax. And in fact, when the MMT lens makes you look at taxation and say, what's the real role of taxation? It's not to generate money for government spending. It's to take excess government money out of creation. And therefore, you could say, what's another way to do that? And one would be Gazelian idea to have money that depreciates. So that itself would eliminate excess money creation. Or you can have a transactions tax charged on all transactions. And that includes financial transactions, which tend to escape tax these days. So a low level of transactions tax might be able to replace an income tax, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily see the negative impact of the removal of excess government money creation on your own personal bank account. So overall, I'm in favour of replacing income taxes with a transaction tax, which is not a VAT. Every transaction would cop it. You would not get a rebate because somebody else had paid tax before you, which is the way a VAT works. This would just be a tax on every transaction. You get multiple. Every time something was sold, you get a taxation, and that includes buying and selling shares and property and so on. That might work better as a way of controlling excess government money creation than income tax does. But again, the odds of that happening are pretty close to zero.
All right. Well, this just in: the UAE exporting oil is a real benefit to them. Next question. Let's do this one. We're going to be doing it every week, but we'll do it again. It might be a question or a statement. If mainstream models ignore money, debt, and banks, how can they claim to explain a capitalist economy built entirely on those very things? How do neoclassicals explain themselves when they don't take into account some of the most fundamental parts of capitalism? Steve.
This is a nice little brainwashing thing that happens when you do economics, because, and this is what Schumpeter called the Ricardian vice. It's Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis is a gigantic book. I think it's 1,100 pages, very, very detailed. But he at one point talks about Ricardo's personality, and he said that Ricardo's interest was in getting clean-cut, rapid answers to policy questions. And he said the interdependence of everything upon everything else, which caused Thunen so much worry, probably never cost Ricardo as much as a night's sleep. So he said what Ricardo then does is set up a set of assumptions, which by putting the assumptions together, the conclusions are determined by the assumptions. So what neoclassicals teach their students is that you can model individual preferences using what they call indifference curves. And that shows you have a particular commodity on the horizontal axis, it might be bananas. Another commodity on the vertical axis, that might be cups of tea. And then you say, what combination of bananas and cups of tea gives you the same utility? So you can have lots of cups of tea and a small number of bananas, or lots of bananas and a small amount of cups of tea. And those combinations will give you the same amount of utility. That's your indifference curve. And then they have the further out your indifference curve, you have higher utility for combinations with more of both of those commodities. That'll give you a high level of utility. So your objective is to get the highest level of utility you can. Now, your budget line constrains how high you can go on that front. So the budget line tells you how much you on the horizontal axis, you get your income. And given that income and the price of bananas, that tells you how many bananas, the maximum number of bananas you could buy if you only buy bananas. Equally, cups of tea, the other extreme, your income divided by the price of a cup of tea. That tells how many cups of tea you could buy if you only bought tea. And then you can buy any combination on that straight line. That's your budget line. So what they get students to think in these terms about how consumers make decisions. And then they say, what happens if we double all prices and double incomes? Now, what you do, you double the income, so the budget line moves out away from the origin, so you get twice as much as you can buy. But you double all prices, well, that means you end up in the same bloody point. So consequently, the correct answer to what happens if you double all prices and double all incomes is nothing, sir, because the utility maximizing combination is the same. Therefore, neoclassical conclusion, money doesn't matter. The amount of money is unimportant. It's the goods you buy with it. Money is simply a veil over barter. If you remove the veil, we see the system more clearly. And then students say, oh, okay, so therefore money doesn't really matter. and we can model capitalism as a barter system, and the conclusions flow, and money is just a irrelevance. We can ignore it. That's the garbage they teach their students, because it's simply not true. Again, if you live in a world with debt, if you have credit card debt or mortgage debt or anything else, and you double all prices and incomes, you don't change the debt. You don't double everybody's debt at the same time. So if you change all prices and incomes and you're in debt, by doubling the price level, you've halved your effective level of debt, and you made yourself better off. If you're a lender, you've got, your asset is other people's debts, you've halved the value of those assets. You're worse off. So inflation has dramatic impacts upon people who have either debt or own the assets. The debt of other people is their asset. And we live in a capitalist economy with debt, guys and girls. So therefore, changing relative price, doubling all prices and doubling incomes is not neutral in a monetary economy, and that completely changes the relevance of doing of learning this stuff in economics. Money matters, and also money turns up as an essential part of increasing demand. And capitalists are not trying to acquire commodities. This is the other fallacy. And Marx has a wonderful rap on the whole idea that capitalists are in it for utility maximization. You're in a capitalist economy. They're in there for maximizing their wealth, which is accumulation of money. So the way that neoclassicals justify leaving it out is by leaving out the heart and soul of capitalism, and then they think they're modeling the capitalist economy. They're doing anything but. Somebody's muted again.
I wish I had like an automatic like AI interface. Maybe Restream will do that one day.
Yeah,
Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe button, as Steve would say. Make sure you hit that notification bell too if you're over on X. Come here and watch at the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel. Here's a good one. I'll give my suggestions here. It is directed at you though, Steve. Prof. Steve Keen, please suggest some books to learn economics. So for me, right now in my life. So for macroeconomics, a good reference book, obviously, is The General Theory by John Maynard Keynes. Although I could say you could discount the whole part on the theory of consumption and the inducement to invest. It's quite dry to me. But some other books I would really recommend if you're interested in modeling economics, and maybe specifically microeconomics, is John Sterman's Business Dynamics. It's a 1,000-page textbook / book that is incredibly cool to go through. Principles of Systems by Jay Forrester, that gives you an understanding of systems in general, and he does mention a lot of economic systems. And again, another great book is Industrial Dynamics by Jay Forrester. This is kind of the first real big use case of system dynamics in economics, where Jay Forrester went to GE, General Electric, and they were having a problem where they were going through cycles in their business that were apart from the macroeconomic business cycle. And he went in there and discovered that the structure of their business themselves was creating these endogenous cycles over time. He did many different models in that book. Really, really interesting. It gives you a causal understanding of microeconomics in that case. And of course, you can scale that up or look at a tops-down approach of the macroeconomy and use system dynamics as well. Steve, your top books to learn economics. Don't mention yours. Just give your kind of all-time greats that you really appreciate.
Well, the all-time great for me definitely is Blatt's Dynamic Economic Systems, a post-Keynesian approach. Okay? Have you read that one, Ty?
I have not.
Okay, that's one for you. Okay, you'd love it. So Blatt is a mathematician, or was a mathematician, who got invited to an economics seminar given by an old friend of mine, Murray Kemp, who's was a neoclassical developer of theories of international trade. And when Murray finished giving his seminar, he asked Blatt what he thought of the paper, and Blatt replied, "That is the greatest load of rubbish I have sat through in my academic career. If this is advanced economics, there's something seriously wrong with economics. I intend finding out what it is. Good day." He left the room and then started working on the book, which became Dynamic Economic Systems, a Post-Keynesian Approach. I think it's an absolutely brilliant book to go through both the history of economic thought and what alternative economics should be. So that's my number one recommendation. I've actually put another one in the chat that I like a lot as well, because when I started teaching myself an alternative approach to economics, as it happened, Jan Kraegel, who's a well-known post-Keynesian, Jan Kraegel published a book called Political Economy, the Reconstruction of Post-Keynesian Economics. And I found that book and taught myself Robinsonian, Joan Robinson's approach to economics at the time. So I'd recommend that one as well. I'll give a copy of that and see if I can paste that into the chat here. Let's see. So definitely Blatt. Kraigel's also worth a read. It's I think less relevant than I would now regard it as having read it at the time, because I don't think Joan Robinson's approach is the only way to go forward. But yeah, definitely that. There's two new books actually, and one that I have to read yet. I've received that I haven't had a chance to read it yet. This is new work. Is that the right way around or back to front, Ty?
You are set to mirrored, so you are backwards, and your AI tracking. Oh, look at there I am. Hey,
no, oh no!
hi.
Oh my god! Oh my god! That's gone terribly wrong. Oh no! Hang on. Okay, come up here, you little bastard. Where are we? Yeah. So, he wants to look at you again, Ty. Oh my god! This is worse than last time. Can I get the bugger to stare straight ahead? No, it's locked on you. Oh dear, you've been targeted. So I'm going to have to hold that damn thing there for a while and try to. Actually, funnily enough, I'm touching the camera and it's bloody white hot.
If it's the same camera I've got, the Insta 360.
That's the one. Okay.
Yeah, if you just hold your hand up, you can turn off the AI
Okay,
tracker.
I'm going to bring up the controller and see
or
if I
bring
can
up
get
the controls.
Insta controller, so I can bring that up. And
well, Steve's doing that. Can anybody guess which book Steve has written that I find to be the favorite? We can go the manifesto. We can go debunking economics, whatever version you choose. His Can It Happen Again? Financial. What's the title of your middle book, the red covered one?
Can we avoid another financial crisis?
Okay, so I've read that one. I kind of gave it away that might be my least favorite one.
It's my least favorite as well, I might add.
Yeah, not because it's bad. It's actually, if you want a quick, I think it's only about 100 pages.
It's quite short, 120 pages, yeah.
So you can get through it really fast. It is good fast food economics. So anybody can guess which my favorite book out of the two would be, Debunking Economics or the Manifesto. Put it in the chat. Steve has fixed his camera. I think we're past the book things. This came up when we were talking about Marx, and a minstrel's a long time viewer here, so we'll answer this question. So how does the use value and exchange value translate into the processes and wages?
Okay, complicated question. I'll do my best to give a good answer of it. So the way that Marx discovered the use value, exchange value, actually dialectic, was he reread Hegel by sheer accident when he was writing the Grundrisse. Well, the Grundrisse, I think the translation, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it badly, but it's German for rough draft. And so what it was Marx's handwritten notes as he was up at the British Library, which I walk past every time I go to England. I go through St. Pancras and walk past I think it's the museum, actually, I'm not sure, British Museum, which is up next to St. Pancras. If it's the library, somebody correct me, but that's the building he worked in. And he'd go to the reading room there and he'd grab all the books which he'd read beforehand, those Ricardo and Smith and all the other pre-neoclassical economists he was reading in the 1860s. And read them, and just going back and rereading the notes, because in 1857, Marx was convinced the revolution was just around the corner. So he wanted to write Capital, his intended magnum opus, as a guide to the revolutionaries when the revolution hit, which of course it didn't. So this is 1857. And then in the middle of that year, a guy, I think it was Otto Breyer, so somebody who was a follower and associate of Marx from Germany, came past. And Breyer had Marx's own copy of Hegel's, I think it was Hegel's Philosophy of Right or Phenomenology of Right. So in the middle of reading all the classical economists, here is Marx reading Hegel, and suddenly all the philosophical stuff that was part of his thinking when he did his PhD in philosophy came back again, and he started to re-express the Marxian. The British Museum's reading room. Thank you very much for that, TK. I thought that was the case. So he's now reading Hegel's dialectic. Now, people, this is one of the crazy elements of how bad ideas can be perpetuated. If you ask virtually anyone who has some knowledge of Marx or thinks they're a Marxist, what Marx's dialectic is, they're going to tell you, oh, it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I can never pronounce the three bloody words. My tongue falls over by the end of the third one. But thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's Marx's dialectic bullshit. That actually belongs to a guy called Fichte, F-I-C-H-T-E. It wasn't Hegel or Marx's at all. And Marx never explained what his dialectic was. But in reading, I was looking for an explanation involving those three words. I never found them except once in all of Marx's writings. And the one time he used it was to abuse, not praise, Proudhon, because Proudhon used thesis, antithesis, synthesis for his own version of a labour theory of value, which Marx rightly ridiculed in a book called The Poverty of Philosophy, which was sending up Proudhon's book, which is called The Philosophy of Poverty. So that wasn't Marx's analysis or Hegel's at all. What you can discern from reading Marx, and you can find it in Hegel, and you can also find it in a brilliant book by a philosopher called Marx and Contradiction, a book by a guy called Wilde, W-I-L-D-E, Marx and Contradiction. It gives the best explanation I've ever read of what Marx's dialectic actually was. And what his dialectic was to say that any entity exists in a society. So he starts off saying, pardon the background moving as I move my hands here. The argument was that any entity exists in a society. Because it exists in a society, the society will focus upon one aspect of that entity, and therefore that becomes the foreground of that particular entity. Now, the entity must include all its elements, so everything else about the entity is put into the background by society. So society focuses upon some aspect of an entity, that becomes its foreground. The other aspects of the entity are necessarily put into the background, and there's therefore a tension between the foreground and the background. Society sort of stretches the object, so it focuses upon the foreground, ignores the background, but the entity must have both foreground and background estimates, so there's a tension put onto that unity by being embedded in whatever society you're talking about. Now, my favorite example of comparing a feudal society to a capitalist one is that in a feudal society, the focus will be on the utility of whatever object you're talking about. So the utility goes into the foreground, the cost of producing it goes into the background, and the attention is with the utility in the foreground and cost of production in the background. My favorite example of that was something I saw in China in 1981 when I took a group of journalists for a tour of China, and we went through the Forbidden City. This is very early days of the Deng Xiaoping revolt against Marx. So they hadn't taken all the Forbidden City was normally forbidden. You couldn't get in there. We got in there as tourists, special tour, and you saw all these objects of art, which were the imperial family's possessions on display. And one object was a solid gold bar about the size of my arm, bent over like so. So you had solid gold here, and then on this side, masses and masses of diamonds, emeralds, rubies, things which were like a couple of centimeters across, gigantic gems. And the journalist says, "What do you think it is, Steve?" One of the female journalists, Jane, I can't think of Jane's last name. But Jane said, "What do you think it is, Steve?" I said, "Oh, it's obvious, Jane. It's a back scratcher." Ha ha ha. I walked off and she caught up with me and said, "I asked one of the guards, it is a back scratcher." So that was the back scratcher for the emperor. These days, in capitalism, who gives a shit about the utility? You're trying to sell as many back scratchers as possible. They're made of plastic. It's the exchange value, which is the foreground aspect for a capitalist economy. The use value goes into the background. So long as something has utility, you can sell it. You're selling it to make as much exchange value as possible. That's what Marx called the ultimate dialectic of capitalism was the dialectic of the commodity. So in capitalism, the exchange value matters, the use value goes into the background, and there's a tension between those two. So that's Marx's explanation. That's the basis of the utility exercise. Now, then Marx, when he applied that to labour, he said, well, labour, what matters in capitalism is the exchange value of a commodity. The use value is irrelevant. So long as it's there, that's all that matters. So the exchange value, the worker is sold for its exchange value. So what's the exchange value of a worker? It's the cost of the means of production. There's this means of subsistence to keep the worker alive. So that's what you pay for a worker, and you get the use value. What's the use value of a worker? You can make the worker work in a factory for 12 hours a day versus the 6 hours it takes to make the means of subsistence. The gap between the two is where profit comes from, or surplus value. So that's Marx's logic. And the same logic applies to a machine. So it undermines the labour theory of value. But that's the foundation of how we determine wages in Marx's system. So the wages are the objective cost of production of a worker, which are the means of subsistence. Now, if you read everything Marx ever wrote in economics, which I've done, you'll find that whenever he talks about the value of labour power and the wage, he says the minimum wage. So means of subsistence as the wage for workers is the minimum wage. The wage will be above that most of the time, and that's what gives you a class struggle over wages. And again, Marx intended to write an entire book on what he called wage labour, and he wrote a little pamphlet which was renamed Wage, Labour and Capital. But one of the 6 books that Marx intended writing, which he never got to write, was one on wage labour, explaining wage labour dynamics. And in that book, he was going to allow wages to vary depending upon the political bargaining power of workers.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So you are correct. It is the manifesto.
Yeah.
The New Economics. This is my favorite Steve Keen book. Not to say the other ones are good, but this one.
Not good.
No, they're good.
You said not to say the others are good.
Oh, yeah. This is why you don't want me.
You're not going to double negatives here, mate.
You don't want me on your marketing team because I would have just.
Well, when you're a marketing team after you've been rehearsed a few times.
So no, this is a great book, and you know why I like it is because by this point in Steve's writing, biography, he had Minsky Ravel fully flushed out, so it's fully integrated in this book. So in chapter 2, if you're an MMTer, it's got all the godly tables. It shows why MMT is correct from an accounting standpoint. If you're a system dynamicist, chapter 3, you're looking at complexity theory. You're looking at things like the Goodwin model, the extension of the Goodwin model, which is Steve's Minsky-Goodwin model, whatever you want to title it. Obviously, there's a good chapter 5 is bashing of the neoclassicals. So that's always fun. There's some energy, which I think is the next great frontier. Chapter 4 is including energy in economics and modeling that in a complex system. It's just really my favorite because it's a summation of Steve's work. And it's not, you don't need to know system dynamics, but it ties it in with little separate models for each chapter. So it's a great book. Pick it up. I did my plug for you, Steve.
Thank you, man.
So there you go. We're getting close to the top of the hour. We've been doing this for 2 hours. It is the top of the hour. So that is about it, guys. We'll be back next week. Steve, thank you for your time.
Turning up, unlike last week when I stuffed up.
Well, you got here. You got here. Everybody, okay. Thanks for your questions. If I didn't get to them, it's just because there's more than we could do in the 2 hour period. I'll try to look out for your name next week. Until then,